In the fall of 1996, the world was introduced to a new video game icon, a wacky marsupial that became the Sony PlayStation's unofficial mascot. Today we'll learn about how developer Naughty Dog created one of the first 3D platformer, their ambitious goal to take on Mario and Sonic, and how the character was almost going to be named Wezzy Wombat. This is the story behind Crash Bandicoot. In January of 1994, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, 23-year-old game developers Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin had set up a booth showcasing their latest game, in search of a publisher. The two had previously worked on a few games for the Apple II and the Sega Genesis, and have incorporated the video game company Naughty Dog. The game they brought to CES was called Way of the Warrior, a 2D fighting game that resembles Mortal Kombat. By sheer luck, their booth just happened to be near Universal Interactive's, who were looking to work with game developers. Despite being a bit unoriginal, the game caught the attention of Universal VP Mark Cerny, who used to be a game developer himself. Mark believed in Andy and Jason's abilities and decided to publish Way of the Warrior and fund Naughty Dog's next 3 games. Mark would eventually join Andy and Jason on their next game, and the 3 were the main creative contributors to the game that would become Crash Bandicoot. After closing the deal with Universal, Andy and Jason were invited to develop their next game in Los Angeles next to the Universal lot. While moving from Boston to LA on a 3-day drive, they began brainstorming what their next game would be. They visited arcades across the country for research and saw an opportunity. At the time, the leading game genres had begun making their transition to 3D. Racing games had with Ridge Racer and Virtual Racing, fighting games with Virtual Fighter, and shooters with Virtual Cop. However, their favorite genre, the character platform games like Mario and Sonic, are still in 2D. Even their favorite entry, Donkey Kong Country, which had 3D render models, was still a 2D side-scroller. So they've decided that they will be the first to bring the character platformer genre to 3D. Andy and Jason wondered what such a game could look like and jokingly called it Sonic's ass game, because they thought the player would spend most of the time looking at the back of the character. They knew early on that not only would there be levels where the character will move into the screen, but there will also be levels where the player will move side to side like a traditional side-scroller, and even towards the screen. The latter, of course, became the iconic Boulder levels. They questioned how the camera will work and the player's ability to judge depth. But a more important question was, which console would they make the game for? After analyzing the state of the consoles at the time, they chose the Sony PlayStation due to its capability to render 3D, but more importantly, it lacked something its main competitors had. While Sega had Sonic and Nintendo had Mario, the PlayStation was lacking a mascot, a role that can be filled by their 3D character platformer. So they signed a developer agreement with Sony and paid a whopping $35,000 for a PlayStation dev kit. That's almost $70,000 in today's value. And production officially began in October of 1994. To create the game's lead character, they wanted to do what Sega had done with the Hedgehog and Warner Brothers had done with the Tasmanian Devil, and find an animal that was cute, real, and no one really knew about. After flipping through a picture book of Tasmanian mammals, they decided that the wombat, the potoroo, and the bandicoot all fit the bill. So in the meantime, they went with the wombat and used Willie the Wombat as a placeholder name. To help with the creative process, the team actually hired 2 Hollywood cartoon designers for character and background designs. Crash, or Willie at the time, was originally a squat and hunkered down character. After one of the designers experimented with a version of Crash that was leaner, with a larger nose, the team decided to go down this route, and these traits were eventually incorporated into Crash's final design. However, a lot of finer details of Crash were decided due to the hardware limitations of the PlayStation. and the low resolution of screens. For instance, Crash's head was made large to allow his facial expressions to be discernible, because unlike Mario and Sonic, Andy and Jason wanted their character to be expressive and animated like a Disney character. Also, details such as gloves, spots on Crash's back, and the light-colored chest were added as visual cues to help the player quickly determine which side Crash was facing. For the villain, the team conceived the character while eating at an Italian restaurant near Universal. Andy came up with the idea of an evil genius with a big head, who was all about his attitude and his minions. Jason, who was a big fan of the animated series Pinky and the Brain, had imagined a more malevolent version of Brain, with minions resembling the Weasel's characters in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. While waiting for their food, Andy, who has a flair for the theatrics, puts on a silly voice and intoned, "If you had 3 neurons between you, you couldn't make a triangle." And just like that, the name Dr. Neo Cortex instantly popped into their heads. Aku Aku was originally conceived as an elderly human character who communicated through mumbles only intelligible to Crash, in a manner similar to the dynamic between C-3PO and R2-D2. His name originates from a Polynesian restaurant where the two frequently walked by, which featured giant tiki statues out front. The Aku Aku mechanic to protect Crash was actually a late addition, intended to balance the gameplay's difficulty. In the summer of 1995, the team focused on level design. When they got to the very first level, they encountered a lot of challenges with the movement and the camera. Since the camera is following right behind the player, lots of jungle objects in the distance needed to be rendered. This proved to be a very difficult challenge while trying to fine-tune the basic mechanics. So they decided to start simple and work on one of the side-scrolling levels. That level was Heavy Machinery, a level that actually appears much later in the game. Since it's more like a traditional side-scroller, it was much easier to design. Also, Crash is usually in front of a wall, meaning there will be no object in the distance to render. The team combined a few classic mechanics like drop platforms, bouncy pads, and monsters to track back and forth in simple patterns. They took inspirations from Donkey Kong Country and incorporated mechanics that they believed made that game so successful. After designing their first level, they decided to take on something a bit more ambitious, where the camera sat above and Crash walked both side to side and in and out. That level was the generator room. This is another factory level that included drop platforms, moving platforms, dangerous pipes, and various robots. The mechanical setting again allowed the team to forego rendering complex objects in the distance and focused on making this 2-axis gameplay fun. In both levels, they had to refine Crash's jumping and spinning mechanics. After working on these levels, they revisited the jungle-themed levels and designed jungle rollers. This time, to get around rendering too many objects in the distance, they arranged the level as a corridor between trees and strategically placed leaves to obscure the field of vision in order to reduce the amount of objects to render at one time. Once they had these 3 types of levels nailed down, things really began to get on a roll. For each type of levels, they would typically do 2 to 3 stages. The first with the introductory set of challenges, and the later ones adding in new twists with increasing difficulty. By February of 1996, over 20 levels had been created, which were in various stages of completion. One of the last levels created was Stormy Ascent, which was roughly 4 times longer than the other levels. Although Stormy Ascent was fully playable, Naughty Dog deemed the level too difficult and lacked time to make it easier. They wanted to cut it from the game completely before submitting the Gold Master to Sony, but removing the level was considered too risky. Stormy Ascent was left hidden within the disc and actually accessible to play via GameShark. This level was later recreated by Vicarious Visions and released as a DLC for the Crash Bandicoot remake. In May of 1996, while Naughty Dog was gearing up for their debut at E3, they were figuring out just what to call the game. Willy the Wombat was just too goofy sounding. They eventually decided on the name Crash, due to his tendency to crash into boxes, and since he mostly resembles a Bandicoot, the name Crash Bandicoot was born. However, the marketing department at Universal thought differently. They wanted to name the game Wezzy Wombat, and were adamant about it. Naughty Dog rejected that name hard, and the two were at an impasse. It got so bad at one point that the entire Naughty Dog team, which was only 7 people at the time, marched into the head of Universal's office and said, "Either we go with Crash Bandicoot, or you can name the game whatever you want and finish the development yourself." Of course, we all knew how that turned out. However, Naughty Dog couldn't win every battle. Crash's girlfriend Tawna ended up on the chopping block after Crash won. Unlike the name Crash Bandicoot, Tawna just wasn't worth fighting for. After wrapping the demo, the team finally made it to E3. Crash Bandicoot was given a prime spot at the Sony booth. The team could not believe their eyes when they saw a huge wall of TVs, all playing footages of their game. A truly triumphant moment. However, Nintendo also debuted their first 3D platformer, Super Mario 64. Because of the perceived rivalry, Crash Bandicoot got a lot of attention at E3. Throughout development, the team was truly fearful of Mario 64, so they were dying to try it out at E3. And when they did, they had mixed feelings about it. On one hand, they felt that the game was massively innovative. However, the early 3D camera AI was extremely frustrating at times, and the environment was very blocky. In comparison, Crash was a much more linear game, but had much better visuals. To gear up for the release, Sony appointed Amy Blair as the marketing manager for Crash Bandicoot. Since Sony was new to the game industry, it needed to find a voice for itself as the challenger brand. So the marketing team thought of an idea where the game inspires this crazed fan to make an outfit of Crash and drive up to Nintendo and challenge Mario. The team shot 10 to 15-second clips of this crazed fan's journey to Nintendo, and the 30-second commercial was the big showdown moment.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived. Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you.
Eric Mode, who was the copywriter for the commercial, said, "I think it gave Sony and that game a real cool attitude and the feeling that this is almost like a renegade, rebellious brand and game maker."
Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot, it's an Australian name.
The development of Crash Bandicoot spanned a total of 18 months. It was released in North America on September 9th, 1996. The game was met with generally favorable reviews from critics. GameFan magazine rewarded it the Game of the Month title and gave both Crash Bandicoot and its competitor Mario 64 perfect scores. Determined that Mario 64 is the perfect action-adventure game, and Crash is the perfect action platformer. However, some critics like GameSpot were less forgiving and criticized the game for its linear gameplay and lack of room for exploration. The public, however, loved Crash. In just 4 months after release, the game sold over 1 million units worldwide, and its success continued into the years that followed. When the sequels were released, sales of the original game spiked as new fans are discovering Crash. By November of 2003, at the end of the sales cycle, Crash Bandicoot sold over 6.8 million units worldwide, making it the #1 selling PlayStation 1 game of all time in the United States, and number 11 worldwide. Following the release of Crash Bandicoot, Naughty Dog developed and released 2 sequels. Crash Bandicoot 2, released in 1997, and Crash Bandicoot Warped a year later. They also made the car racing spin-off Crash Team Racing in 1999, all to critical acclaim and commercial success. The Crash Bandicoot series established Naughty Dog's reputation in the video game industry. What's once a 2-person startup has now become one of the most successful and prolific game studios in the world, and have created some of the most influential series, including Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, and The Last of Us. After the publishing deal between Universal and Sony ended in 2000, several more Crash games were developed by different developers, which received mixed reviews. None could really capture the magic that Naughty Dog created. even though Sony never officially appointed a mascot. To this day, fans will agree that Crash Bandicoot was the unofficial mascot of the PlayStation.